everyone. This is Nicholas Capman with the FDA Group, and today is our first episode of the Passionate Workforce podcast. Thank you for joining. As I mentioned, my name is Nicholas Capman. I'm the author of The Passionate Workforce, How to Create and Maintain Maximum Employee Engagement. So if you haven't got a copy, please buy one. Today I'm speaking with Jennifer Mascioli-Tudor. Hey, Jennifer, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. So today we are going to be speaking about, actually, could you give an introduction of yourself before we get started?
Sure, happy to do so. My name's Jennifer Mascioli-Tudor. Like you said, I've been in the quality and regulatory space for over 20 years, predominantly in leadership positions. Recently transitioned to starting my own consulting firm. I live in the Bay Area, and so there was plenty of opportunity to help small emerging growth tech companies with their quality and regulatory strategies. But I'm also a student of leadership philosophies and principles and really harnessing sort of synergies and the power of teams. So I'm really excited to talk about this particular topic today with you.
Awesome. And the topic is how to drive excellence across teams.
Mhm.
So with that said, how do you define organizational excellence in today's dynamic business environment, and why is it crucial for leaders to prioritize it?
So we know right now the whole paradigm is shifting. Coming out of the pandemic, there's this whole sort of shift to working from home. There's a whole bunch of, philosophies and different mindsets, if you will, with respect to how people are showing up to work. And so as leaders, we need to really pay attention to that because we can't really move forward with how we manage things historically. And so we have to make sure that we're promoting a workforce of agility, and especially in quality and regulatory, it doesn't mean that we're bypassing any sort of regulations, but it means that we need to really understand how people are viewing not only sort of the workforce or work environment, but also what the whole landscape is doing, right? Not just within our industry, but what other industries are doing. And do we want to follow, or do we want to be sort of a pioneer and be first in class there? So there's a whole bunch of discussion around what does the new work environment look like for our industry? How do we make sure that we're still innovating quickly? We're still having those in-person discussions, perhaps not in person. So agility is really important. The other thing is around growth mindset. And so I think this is something that's come up, at least in my space, quite a bit over the last couple of years in terms of how do we go from shifting to we've always done it that way, what got us here will get us there. We know that's really not the case. And so promoting at the leadership level and cascading it down, this whole notion of growth mindset. And one of the things, certainly living in the Bay Area, Carol Dweck, who wrote Mindset, really sort of promoted this initiative specifically around kids, but applied this to sort of the professional realm as well in terms of you might not know how to do it yet, but if you have the appetite to learn and continuously improve, as an organization, you can continue to learn and grow.
Mm.
And so I think, in my opinion, really being able to promote these philosophies at the leadership level and baking them into your core values just helps sort of seed it into your culture and then promotes that moving forward. So in my opinion, those are some of the key, at least lessons learned for the last couple of years, in my opinion, in terms of leadership philosophies.
Yeah. I'll make a comment and then I have a question. The
Yeah.
mindset thing you mentioned, especially for kids, and
Yeah.
I have a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old.
Okay.
And so I like to kind of hear what are they learning about and all that stuff. And um, good for us as a society because the
Yeah.
schools now uh, are, I would argue, a lot better than when we were in school.
Yeah.
I remember now with the internet, um, I was afraid that we were going to stick to memorization.
Yeah.
And there's no need for that to an extent,
Hmm.
especially with like history. And I
Hmm.
learned like in history, they're talking about how to connect all the time periods
Yeah.
through technology or connect it through government. And so they're really able to connect that because I remember growing up, it was Renaissance, Enlightenment,
Yeah.
and they were all separate. There was no continuation.
Hmm.
But with mindset, I think as kids are coming up with their identity, they have to say, who am I? Am I the smart kid? Am I the funny kid? Am I the caring kid? Am I the bad kid? Am I the stupid
Mm-hmm.
kid?
Mm-hmm.
And understanding that growth mindset and not fixed mindset applies to everybody allows people to kind of take a breather when they fall short and say, okay, I'm not there yet, but it doesn't
Right.
mean that I can't get there. Right.
Right. And it
Uh,
shifts from a punitive environment where, especially in our space, in the med tech space, we're learning continuously. We're either learning from FDA or regulatory intelligence, we're learning from our own post market data, we're learning from innovation as you sort of turn the crank on product development. So we're constantly learning. And so the shift from, why didn't you do this right? How come this was wrong? To, what did you learn from this? How do we optimize and take this experience and grow from it and essentially expand that knowledge across the organization? Organizations that shift into that mindset, first of all, they promote psychological safety, right?
mm,
So if you're someone within an organization and you don't feel the ability or the freedom to express some thoughts, and obviously they're within sort of confines, right? But I mean, if you feel very liberated to go and express your thoughts without the fear of having repercussions or punitive conversations or being, embarrassed, right, in front of a group, then you're going to really generate so much more innovation and thought and ideation. And from there, to me, it's a springboard to growth mindset. So it really, to me, starts with the top. If you're seeing the top facilitate and foster this will cascade down. If you see the top talk about it but not foster it, you're still going to be apprehensive, right, to go and express what you truly think. And
mm.
that really will limit innovation and growth, in my opinion.
Yep, I agree 100%. In fact, one of the things that we promote here at the FDA group is we tell people that join, we don't encourage people to speak up, we require it.
That's great.
And this kind of goes back to a lesson that I had early in my career, where I was working at a pharmaceutical engineering firm, and there were a lot of processes that were terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember blaming executive management quietly in my own head, right? And just saying,
Mm-hmm.
boy, these people are really dumb.
Mm-hmm.
How could they allow this to happen? And what I learned is it wasn't necessarily that they allowed it to happen. Nobody felt safe to speak up and say, hey, this is an issue. There probably is a better way to do it.
Right.
And I think it's important for people that are reporting up to understand that while executives, leaders, and managers have an idea as to what's going on, they don't know the whole story. And that's
Mm-hmm.
why I think it's, to your point, on us as leaders and managers to create that safe environment so that we can get that information from those that are actually holding it.
Right. And I also think there's something to be said about situational leadership. So you mentioned, the philosophy at the FDA group is it's a requirement to speak up. If you're an introvert, you're not going to probably be as likely to speak up if you're in a room full of extroverts, right? So it's
Mhm.
really being able to read the room. There's a really good book by Jennifer Conweiler who talks about the introverted leader, and she really focuses on the differentiation between an introvert and an extrovert and sort of the differences in terms of skills, in terms of opportunities. How do you connect an introvert and an extroverted leader so that you can have good cohesion and synergy? So, the other thing I believe strongly in as a leader is not everyone is bringing the same personality to the workforce. In addition, not everyone's motivated, excuse me, by the same thing. And so being able to really discern introvert, extrovert, what motivates your employees, again, is a differentiator.
Absolutely. I wanted to go back to earlier in the conversation where you talked about kind of where the way things used to be and where we're
Yeah,
going. Could
right.
you define the timeline? So when you say the way things used to be, are we talking 1990? Are we talking pre-pandemic? Are we talking 1 year ago? And then what did that period, as you're defining it in your mind, look like? Where are we today and where are we going?
I think if we start pre-pandemic, there was sort of this rule of thumb, right? I mean, essentially, everyone was showing up to work. We were obeying the rules of engagement, essentially. So I've predominantly gone into the office 5 days a week. There was never sort of a a landscape or a world in my mind that I wouldn't be doing that. And so when the pandemic hit and everyone had to shelter in place and really pivot, it became an opportunity to reassess how people show up for work. There's obviously debates in terms of effectiveness of work from home and making sure that you're still productive and you're having those team engagements. But I think if you look at the timeline, we have sort of leading up to the pandemic, which was perhaps traditional corporate America, where you show up, there's very little work from home unless those are baked into the job. And then you have kind of through the pandemic where there's this realization of, oh gosh, we actually can be very effective because we have to be as part of the working from home. And not only that, but now we're starting to see this balance, right? So now you're not living in the Bay Area again. Commutes can range from 1 to 2 hours each way. So now you're essentially cutting that out and you're able to sort of put that back into your work. And now you're post pandemic and everyone's left scratching their head going, okay, what is the new norm? We have organizations that are extremely big advocates of working from home because they saw the value in their employee engagement, and the work-life balance became a core value of the organization. And then you have, I think, other organizations that are a little bit fearful to give in entirely because they're not sure how this will affect their productivity. So I think we're in this big paradigm shift. If you want my honest answer, I think there are some organizations that really get it, especially in tech. We have some tech companies out here who've effectively said, if you want to work from home, you can. And then we have other tech companies that are actually saying the opposite, right? Like you must come in 3 days a week minimally or else. And so this is where, we start to see fear-based leadership, where if you're someone who hears the message from leadership, you must come in or else, how is that going to sit with you as someone who wants to do their very best in an organization? You're already coming in with a little bit of fear versus an organization that's more dynamic, more agile, as I mentioned earlier, agility, listening to the voice of the customer, of the employees, and really understanding what drives and motivates, and then universally applying that and making sure that it's well understood across the organization. So it's very deliberate. It's not something that I think you can just hope to happen organically. The best organizations spend hours, days, months thinking about strategically how they're going to introduce this and introduce the change management to the organization, and then apply it. Again, go back to growth mindset. What's working, what's not working, let's course correct quickly. Let's make sure we communicate often. So all these things in my mind contribute to either you are successful or you fail quickly, right? So there's no sort of in between. You're either going to do really well and the organization's going to lift, or you're going to have some unintended consequences perhaps with your workforce.
Yeah. Same thing. I want to make a statement and then ask a question. So I think I came up with this terminology,
Okay.
but maybe I heard it from somewhere else and it's not mine, but I think I created it, which is not work-life balance, but work-life blend.
Yes.
And the reason I changed that is balance, I see back in the 2000s and before, where I'm in the office
Yeah.
and I have to be there in order to do my job.
Right.
And then when I leave, I don't have the technology and tools in order
Right.
to work. So the balance was, okay, don't keep me here from 7 to 7 because I actually do need a personal life. So we got to cut down that 12-hour workday to something more manageable so that I can
Right.
actually rest and enjoy life. So that
Yeah.
was balance. Blend now, and the reason I use that is one of the things that I always had a problem with is rules for thee, but not for me, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna be able to say, you know what, I'm gonna cut out early on a Thursday and go golfing, that applies to everybody else.
Right.
Okay. And so I don't get special privileges that other people shouldn't be able to take advantage of. It really should be, am I producing? um, in to the extent that my position requires me to, and then that applies to everybody else. So if people and the blend is in a business in a work day, you're doing maybe 80% work, 20% personal stuff. I got to pick
Mm-hmm.
up my kids. I got to schedule a doctor's appointment. I got to do, run to the store. I got to do this, that, and the other thing. On the flip side, during my personal life, right after dinner, I got to take a 30-minute phone call, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a little bit of the blend. So I guess my question is when we're talking about companies now saying we embrace remote and we
Yeah.
want people to allow to decide what's going to work best for them. Then you have the other ones that say 3 days in or else. Why do you think the companies that are embracing remote are doing so? What do they what do you think their perspective is? And then for those that aren't embracing it and saying we've got to come back to the old way of doing things, what do you think their perspective is?
Yeah, just to sort of build upon what you were saying, we've all heard this probably in some parts of our career is you never work a day in your life if you love what you do, right? So we can debate this all day long because I love what I do and I also choose to work the hours that I choose because that's my choice, right? And especially in consulting, you have the flexibility and you have some autonomy to make choices versus when you're in corporate America, if you have strict timelines with respect to projects, or for instance, you have an FDA audit or something's happening that's basically time based, some of those freedoms go away. So when we think about remote work, I believe that the folks that are encouraging it are the people that saw really amazing things happen through the pandemic. Things that were not achievable or things that were aspirational in nature actually came to fruition. And so you have some of those data points. You're not picking out a single person, you're moving as an organization. We think about going back to, books. Simon Sinek says, start with why.
Mhm.
And so when we think about the why we're doing it, if you have not defined that as an organization and you're not moving in cohesion, and even all the way down to an operator, if they don't know the why, then it becomes really hard to trust, depend, and predict versus the organizations that perhaps don't have that well defined, haven't seen good, key performance indicators, maybe missed targets, saw some heavy attrition. I think there's a little bit of PTSD, if you will, in terms of the different sides of the coin. And so it really is seated in the experience of the organization. I know a lot of organizations that did amazing things through the pandemic, things that they didn't even think that were achievable because everyone rallied around the flag, knew that they had a mission, even though they were at home, but they pushed, they were loyal, and they made things happen. Versus perhaps the flip side, where maybe it was disorganized, maybe expectations weren't well understood. There's a whole host of reasons. To me, it starts with why first, but it also starts with how do you, as a leadership team, get buy-in from your workforce, whether you're a 5-person company or a 50,000-person company. That really becomes your anchor as an organization. If that's not well understood, then you can't produce the way I think organizations are expecting you to produce, whether you're remote or on site. To me, location doesn't matter. So I think that's what we're seeing is we're seeing perhaps a little bit of uncertainty, a little bit of confusion. Maybe it wasn't a muscle that was well defined before the pandemic. Now it's even harder. So I really believe that there's a lot to be said about starting at the top in terms of vision, mission, and the whole change management curve, making sure that, just as leaders like you and I at the leadership level, we understand it. But if you went down to the very, most junior person, would they understand it and can they articulate it? So to me, this is all within the framework of success and things that if you're not seeing that as an organization can quickly be rectified, but it does take some work.
Mm. I want to focus in on the start with why thing.
Yeah,
And the reason I want to is in some organizations, the why is easily seen and defined. So
right,
if I'm a company that is developing, manufacturing, commercializing cancer-saving drugs,
right.
it's pretty obvious. We've all been
Mm-hmm.
in those facilities and they've got the patients on the board with a little quote about how the medication helped and so on and
Right.
so forth. But for some other organizations, it might be a little bit more obtuse and
Yeah.
hard to define. And we do have a why.
Okay.
However, what I'm going to do is explain one way we attempted to define our why. Well, it was, I shouldn't say attempted because the why was already there, but let me get to my point.
Yeah.
At one point, we tried to connect the work we were doing with those patients.
Mm-hmm.
What we found was that the gap was too big between what we
Mm.
were doing and what looks like we paused. Hold on. All right, sorry about that, everybody. The camera paused. Um, so there was a gap, and it was hard for us to connect what we were doing with those patients. It was just too far, and we couldn't feel it, right? And some companies like the drug making companies, very easy. But what about the companies like consulting firms or people, providing technology or clean room services or things like that? How would you, for those that haven't identified their why and they feel like they're too far away, they're not saving hunger, they're not promoting
Right.
world peace, how do they find a why?
Yeah. Fundamentally, you have to be able to translate it for all levels of the organization. So if we think about strategic imperatives, and when you start, whether you have a 1 year strategic imperative plan or you have a 5 year, right? It's contingent on where you are as an organization. The ability for executive leadership to translate it down to all levels of the organization. It doesn't mean that you have to do it. It means that you have to be able to have that talk track or that playbook to present it to your VP, and then the VP is able to present it down to their director, and the director is able to present it down to the managers, and then you synthesize it down even further for inspectors or even junior level consultants, folks that perhaps are just recently graduated and are relatively new to the business, and this is maybe the first time they've experienced corporate America, if you will. And so being able to synthesize it, I always think about the change curve, because I'm one where someone introduces a change to me and I very quickly get to the end of the change curve and I'm like, I'm good. Right? Like, I'll figure out what we need to do to make it happen, the execution and tactical. But in terms of flipping the switch, you tell me something, and for the most part, I can get to the very end and then become a change agent.
Mm.
Not everyone's like that, right? A lot of people, if we think about, we just had a huge announcement with J&J and Shockwave. Shockwave's located in the Bay Area. That's a huge acquisition integration. And so the ability to present all the different milestones and understand the change management curve for every single employee is important to ensure success of that integration. And so again, it doesn't matter if you're a 50,000 person company or 5 person, being able to again look at your team and understand, is Janet going to get to the same space as quickly as Bob? And if not, how do I sort of marry the two and have those conversations? So to me, it's all around the intimacy that you have as a leader and being able to connect and talk transparently and have those conversations with your team. Because the ones that don't, the ones that are perhaps shy or bashful and they don't want to have those difficult conversations, it's really a disservice to the team. Because really, if you think about any change perhaps that you've been through, you're hungry for information, right? You want to know. You might not be able to know everything because some of it might be confidential, but you're hungry to just hear a snippet of, what did you hear? Because otherwise you might then have water cooler talk where people make their own, they create their own stories, and then those stories get translated to this other person. Like, it's just the telephone line. So how do you make sure that you sort of mitigate that? And to me, it's around communication. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I believe that there's a lot of different tools available, and it's not a one size fits all. And it's also customized perhaps to the organization. So consulting versus traditional med tech, and also perhaps level of the individual or the team that you're speaking to.
Yeah, that's great. I'm gonna complement what you said with kind of my own perspective, which is similar and different. And then I want to move on to continuous improvement and innovation. So we at the FDA group, we use EOS, which is the
Okay.
entrepreneurial operating system. And it's just a way of running your organization. And when
Yeah.
we started the implementation, the way we were able to identify our why was we had the executive team and we had an implementer, and the
Okay.
implementer said, Nick, do you get a case of the Mondays? And I said, no, actually, I don't. And he
Uh-huh.
goes, why? And I said, well, I know every day that I'm waking up, I've got employees that are happy. The people that are working for us are happy. We're treat our vendors as partners. The clients are able to, kind of relax because they know we're taking care of things, and
Yeah.
even, we're able to help our communities and the patients that touch the drugs and all of that. And what we found was our why was to enhance people's quality of life, and we're a quality company, so there's a little bit of play on words.
Yeah.
But that
Yeah.
was kind of how we were able to do it. So my point would be, if somebody is still trying to figure out their why, if you're not getting a case of the Mondays, why aren't you? And that might
Hmm.
help you find that why that you're looking for. So I'll just throw that in there.
I love that, by the way, because one of the quotes that I've read recently is if you don't get the sort of like nervous stomach on the Sunday before the Monday starts, then you know you're in the right spot, right? If you
Mhm.
think about how many people get nervous or they're dreading that Monday.
Mm.
And so for you to be able to then take why Monday is actually okay and then translate that into a why statement, I think is a great, great starting tool for anyone who, like you said, is maybe struggling
You
finding their
know,
why.
and actually, for anybody that does get that dread on Sundays, um, politely speaking, you shouldn't be feeling that way.
Right.
And you might want to evaluate if that level of gastrointestinal stress is worth your, weekly routine or not.
Yeah.
Because I can't, I mean, no, we all get stressed,
Yeah, of
but it's
course.
not that constant Sunday, and I can't remember the last time I felt that way. So if people aren't experiencing it, I would encourage them to go and seek it.
Yeah.
Now, I want to move into continuous improvement and innovation. What can
Hmm.
leaders do in order to cultivate that?
Going back on what I said earlier, there's a couple, I think, strong philosophies. Growth mindset, again, can be applied in a lot of different disciplines. So if I'm just going to focus on quality regulatory, when we
Mhm.
think about traditional quality regulatory, we think it's very sort of rigid. We have to color within the lines. There's certain things that we cannot do, and all that is true. But if we think about speed to market and we think about getting patients' use of technology and innovation, quality and regulatory needs to be part of that conversation with marketing, with R&D. And so being able to have those conversations collectively as core functions and talking about the pros and cons and ways to optimize quality systems. So you mentioned, what's sort of the genesis of what has worked and what hasn't worked. The best companies, in my opinion, have consistently looked at their quality and regulatory practices and really tried to make their processes a differentiator, a market differentiator, because they're not sort of stuck in the old. So they're looking for new ways to innovate, even in the quality and regulatory side. And what does that do? It helps drive innovation back on the product teams because they know that it's not going to take them, and I'll just speak for medical devices because pharma is much different, but they know it's likely not going to take them 14 years to get a product to market because they're working with innovation on the quality and regulatory side. So that's just one way, in my opinion, on the med tech side, where you can really empower employees to come up with ways to drive efficiency. So we've all been part of organizations where, and you mentioned this, where it's like, gosh, these processes are terrible. why are we using these 20-year-old processes? How come no one's taking a leap of faith and raising their hand and saying, gosh, if we only changed a small part of this, it would release so much time. So why don't we look at this? And so there's this hesitation to change what's familiar. And
Hmm.
so back to your question, innovation starts with looking for opportunities to drive efficiencies. We think about continuous improvement. We think about operational excellence. We think about things like Kaizens and really looking at current state and not being afraid to look at future state opportunities. All of that to me is important elements to continuous improvement. It's not just when you're running a manufacturing line and gosh, you want to, decrease your tack time or your cycle time. You can apply those philosophies to every single function, even at a consulting firm where perhaps the contracting time takes too long, right? And you want to drive efficiency with your contracting process. Every process can essentially undergo some sort of a continuous improvement. And the most important part of that is that it comes from every part of the organization, right? It's not just you and I going, gosh, this doesn't work, let's change it, and then tell the team. It's the team coming to you and saying, Nicholas, this whole process seems to be a little bit slow. What do you think about me coming up with some solutions and bringing it back to the team, and we can talk about like that? To me just inspires innovation, because you see one person do that and they have a good response from leadership, and guess what happens? Now you have a next, and then you have a next, and then you create this groundswell of of inspiration and innovation. And I think, as leaders, the more open you are to it, the more you're going to foster this entrepreneurial spirit across the organization. So that's how I see operational and organizational excellence. And there's certainly a lot to unpack there, but I think it's very easy to start to shift if one looks to do so.
Yeah, and people follow incentives and disincentives. So if
They do.
somebody's coming up with improvements in processes or ways of bettering the organization, they need to be recognized in public and celebrated.
Exactly.
Because first you want to encourage them to do it again, but to your
Right.
point, the people that are watching, they want that limelight and that glory as well. And so that'll kind of influence their behavior. Um, One of the ways that I would kind of talk about that mindset of continuous improvement is I like to say that I and collectively we live in a
Hmm.
constant state of being comfortably uncomfortable.
Yes, I agree with
And so comfortable in the sense that we know we've got things under control, things are working well, but uncomfortable because there is something that Nicholas Capman and Jennifer Mascioli-Tudor are not doing today,
you.
that
Yeah.
if we had known it, we would have been better at what we were doing.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
there's got to be almost this detective mindset. And
Hmm.
the journey of a million miles starts with one step. So you don't have to go and make this gigantic Titanic shift. It's
Yeah.
just one thing, and my father, God rest his soul, he said, Nick, you don't have to do a lot more than everybody else. You just have to do a little bit more than everybody else.
Hmm. Hmm.
So what I would say in terms of continuous improvement is just try to find what is that one thing that will make just that little bit of difference, and then move on. And then next week, what's that one thing you could do that just makes a little bit of difference? And it's death by a thousand cuts, right?
Yeah.
There must be a better way of describing it, but I think you get the
Yeah.
point, which is
Yeah.
after a while, all of those tiny little changes turn into something big. And I know you've mentioned a lot of books. One of the books that I've been really privileged to have read was Atomic Habits.
Hmm.
And I love the play on words because atomic, it means the opposite of itself. It means
Hmm.
very small and it means really large, right? So all of
Hmm.
these really small changes can turn into something big.
Right. And the other thing I just want to highlight, because one of the things that I believe some companies do really well is like Google, for instance, they have this sort of 80-20 rule. And it's not the traditional 80-20 rule that we think about, but it's 80% you're all in and you're doing everything that you're committed to doing with respect to your function. And then the 20% that's left within the week, and we can sort of dissect whether that's 10 hours, 5 hours, that's like for later, but 20% is for you, right? So as a professional, you also want to be, and you mentioned this, you want to be able to sort of put more tools in your toolbox. And whether that's small little changes that you make sort of along the way, or you volunteer for a project that's outside of your comfort zone, organizations that allow people space to do that make huge impacts on loyalty, on commitments. If you're asking someone to work a little bit later because of a project, they're more likely going to do that because you've invested in them, versus the organizations that are like, we need you to work every Saturday and it's for this project and we don't actually have an end date. So it's having that, like you said the work life
Blend,
balance. What did you say? The
blend,
work life
blend.
blend. Right, the work life blend, because everyone, I think, is curious about what the other person's doing, or perhaps a certification you want to go after. And if you don't, as an organization, allow for some of that space, and maybe 20% is too much, maybe 20% is too little, that's up to the organization to define. But if you don't know that those avenues exist, it's hard to really feel like the company's investing back in you. So, those little things, it's a mutually symbiotic relationship the way I view it, right? It's you're giving yourself, and the company is also providing a work environment, so on and so forth, but it has to be mutually beneficial. So I think being able to sort of articulate what you're interested in, the being uncomfortable and forcing yourself or challenging yourself to continue to learn and be outside your comfort zone, I think those are the best scenarios. And if companies can create that environment, that's amazing. And it
Yeah.
sounds like you're doing that too, which I think is fantastic.
Well, we are 17 years old, so
Yeah,
we've hit that maturity level, and then there's more to go.
right.
So, we'll see how that all works out. One thing that I will add to this whole idea of continuous improvement and innovation is something old school, which
Mm,
is you get what you measure.
hmm.
And so one of the things that I have failed on and also have corrected is we have this great idea, right?
Uh-huh.
This awesome idea. Everybody's going to love it. This is what we're going to do. But we don't put in the measurement.
Hmm.
What
Hmm.
happens is 3 months later, you all are standing in the room and going, remember that thing we were going to do? Whatever that happened to that thing?
Yeah,
Right? And it just kind
right.
of disappeared in the ether.
That's
So,
true.
so if continuous improvement and innovation is something that people are taking really serious, I would encourage them. Generally, you're probably having a weekly team meeting. If you're not, I would encourage people to do so. And you create a measurable, right? And the
Hmm.
measurable could be whatever makes sense for the organization. This quarter, I want one good idea.
Yep.
And that's the goal. And every
Yep.
week, when we're reviewing our KPIs, measurables, etc., we're saying, okay, and everybody has to go through and read their measurables. So I got, 3 to 7 measurables, and I say how I'm doing. And one of my measurables is to create one really cool idea that will
Hmm.
improve the organization this quarter. And I'll either say I'm on track or I'm off track, right? So if
Right.
I'm on track, it means I've been thinking, I've been coming up with some ideas. I haven't, it's not complete, but I think I should have it done by the due date. Off
Right.
track is, hey, I've been trying, I'm hitting a dead end. I need a little bit of help. I need a little bit of juice in order to kind of get me back so that I can hit that.
Right.
So
Right.
I would just say with these types of changes, it's important for people to make sure that they're measuring those.
Yeah. And making sure, and I totally agree, by the way, making sure that you've created those operating mechanisms to have those report outs, and also making sure, like we talked about earlier, if someone is off track for whatever reason, now if they're just not doing their job, that's a different conversation. But if they're coming up against some risks or some challenges, that's a great opportunity to share that and then talk about how you course correct quickly and then make sure the team's back on track. The other thing I will say, just to sort of put a finer point with respect to what you just said, is many organizations come up with 40 key imperatives, right? They launch
Oh,
40 key imperatives in January and they say, we're going to do every single one extremely well. And as someone who's receiving the information, it's overwhelming. So I like what you said in terms of, focus on the things that you can actually achieve, like get some small wins right out of the gate so that it kind of gets that momentum going, and then add to your portfolio. Because many times if you try to bite off more than you can chew as an organization, what does that equate to? Failure. And then you
mm,
see, the team's demotivated. And then, so it's just, there's small little pivots that you can make that really make a huge difference across the organization. But I really, really agree with what you said with respect to, let's identify it, track it, monitor it. And if we have to course correct, we course correct in those meetings, and everyone can hear the conversation, and everyone's then aware when they leave the meeting in terms of what the directive is.
yeah, and there's a lot of there's certain numbers that really jump out to me.
Yeah.
Um, 2 to 3, 3 to 5, three to
Yeah.
seven, and 6. And I'll explain
Yeah.
what each of those mean.
Yeah.
Um, 6 is the maximum number of people I encourage in a meeting.
Okay.
If there's anything more than that, people aren't going to be able to participate and be heard. Now, if it's a town hall, obviously that's one thing,
Sure.
but I'm saying an actual meeting where everybody's
Yeah.
participating.
Mm-hmm.
3 to 7 is really important when I'm thinking about we all work in a 90-day world. And I've used a couple different analogies for a 90-day world, which is
Uh-huh.
um, after a quarterly meeting, everybody's, really ambitious,
Right.
energized. That flame is really high, right?
Yep.
Over 90 days, it starts to come down. And that's how I see a 90-day world. And then you have to, after that 90 days, look back. Did we achieve what we wanted to do? What could we have done better? And what's in the next 90? And then that flame goes up again. So it's really motivating and ambitious.
Yeah.
Um, 2 to 3, 3 to 5, it's more like I need a minimum of things to evaluate and no more than this. And so
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to 3 to 7, that means not 40, right?
Yeah.
If and actually another kind of mantra is if everything's important, then nothing's important. So
Exactly.
you really have to come down to what are those 3 to 7 most important things that we must complete this quarter.
Yep.
Yeah.
I
Um,
totally agree. Yep.
Now I talked about kind of some of the pitfalls, or at least I was talking about that measurement thing. As we're talking about all of this really good content, what are some of the pitfalls that you've seen that you've been able to create a system in order to avoid? And can you share that with the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So you just highlighted something for me where as a leadership team, you come out of the gate and you're so excited. You have these 15 strategic objectives that you just spent days, sort of solidifying with the leadership team, and you want to come out all out with the organization and share them, and it gets lost in translation. And like you said, you then end up having sort of this, not schizophrenic, but it's like this chaos, right? Where people are like, well, do I apply my 50% here? Then do I apply the 25%? So it's really being able to resource load. And if you don't have a good mechanism to really be able to assign that to people, people are going to self assign and they might be assigning the wrong priorities. And so I've seen organizations do this well, where they really talk, like you said, they're like 2 to 3 strategic imperatives. And essentially, then what they do is they create a change management plan around that and they create a playbook around that. So then when you go to press, let's say, if you're in a town hall and you're introducing this Jan 1, you actually have tools that you can provide to the organization to then go and deploy, right? Because
Hmm.
it's one thing to think about these amazing strategic imperatives. And typically, what I see happen is really good ideas, but those ideas then are just handed to a team that maybe wasn't part of that sausage making, if you will. And the expectation is, okay, now go implement. And you're like, well, I don't actually have context. I'm not exactly sure what was meant by some of this. So there's this sort of like time frame where you really have to introduce the topic, talk about the topic, solicit feedback about the topic, and then if you have to make some changes along the way, do that. So again, the good organizations really value change management and they understand the change management curve, and they also understand the importance of communication. The
Mm.
not so good examples are the ones that just, they just basically hand over all of the, imperatives and say go do it, and then what do you see happen? You see chaos, you see confusion, you see you see people perhaps not executing the way you expected, and then at the end of the quarter you're going through and you're seeing red, 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 right? Like your red metrics
Yeah.
are showing up, you're not seeing green, green, green. And how does that land on the employee? You're like, gosh, we just missed every KPI that was assigned to us. How do we now spend the next 2 to 3 quarters recovering, versus if it had been done right the first time, now you spend the second quarter optimizing or focusing on the next 5. So it's a philosophy that, again, if done well, really adds value to the organization. If not done well, guess what you're doing? You're reworking,
Yeah.
right? And reworking is expensive and it's not a fun thing to do if you have to rework something you've already done.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I think one of the things, and I want to kind of come to the final point, which is empowerment, because some people in order for you to act on everything we've been talking about as a
Yeah.
contributor,
Mm-hmm.
you have to feel empowered. You have to feel like your voice counts. You have to
Mm-hmm.
feel like um, it's for me and it's not just for them, right?
Right.
And so, how do we get people into that mindset of empowerment? I'm going to add one point,
Yeah.
and then I'd like to hear your point. Um, I think it's really important for contributors to identify their goals.
Yes.
Okay. If I
Mm-hmm.
give somebody a goal as a directive, then I had nothing to do with it. That person doesn't know whether it's a low bar or a high bar.
Right.
Um, and so I'm not going to take ownership of that goal because it was given to me. I didn't create it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you say in the quarterly meeting, annual meeting, what are the goals for you in your area? And that doesn't mean you just take anything anybody says, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
I say when you bring somebody on,
Mm-hmm.
it's an not entry level employee, but a new employee.
Yeah.
Um, they're tracking their numbers. So we know, all right, these are the metrics we measure, but we're not giving you any
Mm-hmm.
goals. Let's just see
Right.
how you do. But then
Mm-hmm.
you probably are in a room with other people that are doing similar things, and you can kind of see what they're doing and then decide how am I doing compared to them. And, based off of my level of experience in the company and the space and trying to find something that's going to work. And if somebody comes with a goal that maybe seems too high or too low, it is up to the leaders and manager to ask questions about why they think that's appropriate and provide them with some guidance as to why it might not be right. Because you don't want people to, shoot for something that they're going to miss and then they got to mark it red. Vice,
Right.
vice versa, you also don't want them sandbagging, which is picking a really easy goal so they get
Yeah.
all greens, right? So we
That's
got to
right.
find
Yeah.
that happy medium, being comfortably uncomfortable, right? I'm
Yeah.
comfortable I can hit the number, but kind of uncomfortable because
Yeah.
it's going to be a little bit of a stretch.
Right.
So
Right.
I think that's one way that we can get people feeling empowered, which is defining their own goals so that they can be part of the overall team that's really taking ownership of the organization and not feeling like it's just for everybody else.
Yeah.
So, what are some, kind of different ideas that you have in order to get your team members to feel empowered and have a sense of ownership?
I wholeheartedly agree with you. Again, I believe that it starts with the top because you might want to promote an environment of empowerment and problem solving and continuous improvement, but if you don't create the space at the leadership level or at the team level to allow people to feel comfortable coming and actually articulating, if they came to you and you said, okay, I want you to define your goals, and they didn't trust you as a leader to actually articulate how they felt they wanted to approach it, that would be a problem, right? And so although it seems simple, creating that environment of trust, open communication, transparency, and also being comfortable having harder conversations, right? I mean, you can have hard conversations with someone, but if they trust you, they know it's coming from a place of good versus if it's constantly no, or you're feeling, like it's not coming from a place of understanding, like seek to understand, you're gonna essentially foster a completely different environment. So my point of sharing all that is it's fundamentally these are easy concepts, but if you or as a leadership team don't create psychological safety, which again is something that's important, your philosophy perhaps is old school business where it's like my way or the highway, right? We don't have servant leadership philosophies where, let's talk about this together. Let's really understand what's happening sort of cumulatively. If you're not creating that space, then it's really going to be hard to have those open communications. So again, love what you're saying. I think these are all really telling signs of organizational health, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you think about, and I actually did a talk with ASQ recently, and one of the things that I mentioned was, now with social media, you can do your due diligence on organizations, right? You can go to Glassdoor, you can do your due diligence to really understand culture and what employees or past employees are saying. So it's no longer just sort of a one-sided conversation. we are now equipped with social media and technology to do some of this due diligence. And so this is important. This is now more than ever important for organizations to get it right, because people are going to talk, and they're going to talk differently than they talked 20 years ago. Like you said, maybe you just phoned a friend and said, gosh, I had this not so great experience. And then maybe it stops there. Think about the power of communication now with social media, with one person starting one thread of negativity, and it sort of permeates through the social circles. So I only say that because our landscape is changing in terms of communication and sharing information, and employees self-selecting out and making different decisions about, like you said earlier, if you're not feeling good about your Monday morning on Sunday evening, you have the power to make a different decision. So again, just sharing some at least examples that I've seen in terms of walk the walk, talk the talk. And if you're not doing that, it's very noticeable, right? It's very noticeable when organizations say one thing and then you get into a room and that leader does something completely different. It's noticeable.
Mm.
So it's sort of a cautionary tale. Like, be careful what you say as a leadership team. Make sure that you're not having this sort of incongruence of communication, and listen to your employees. Like, truly listen to every employee, not just the loudest ones in the room either. I was going to mention that, there's a lot of people that are always the ones that talk. They're the loudest in the room, so they naturally get all the projects.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of folks that are introverts that perhaps aren't as confident to speak up, but they have just as much to say. So as leaders, see if you can kind of tease that out of your team, and make sure you make space for them.
Yeah. And just to kind of harp on what I said earlier, one thing that might be a tactic in order to facilitate that is tell them you don't encourage people to think and speak up, you require it. And
Yeah,
that will hopefully
exactly.
push those introverts out of their comfort zone and speak, that really useful anecdote that's gonna, help improve the organization. So this was a
But
really, go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, you've probably created, because of that mantra, you've probably created an environment where everyone feels comfortable speaking in a room, right? Because you've already sort of set the tone that this is an acceptable practice. There's no judgment here. We actually encourage it. And so by by promoting that at the very beginning of someone's employment, it sort of like diffuses any trepidation one might have. So I love that, because very few companies actually proactively say that, right? It's sort of implied, but if you don't hear that, you might still feel like, gosh, I don't know yet if I'm ready to speak up. So I just think promoting that early and then encouraging it along the way just helps build this really amazing culture, at least from what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and it just comes back to a sense of being having humility, right? And
Yeah,
when somebody
yeah,
comes in saying, "Look, I have an idea as to what's going on, but I'm not
yeah.
all knowing.
Right,
I don't know what's happening everywhere, every second of the day. And if it's
right,
not being communicated to me, then I can't do anything about it."
right.
And I
Exactly.
always harp back on that previous discussion where I said these executives are a bunch of idiots, not knowing they weren't idiots. It's just nobody was speaking up.
Right,
So,
right.
I think that's really important.
Yep.
Um, this was awesome. I'd like to ask you two questions as we wrap up.
Sure.
You're obviously very well read, so I'd like to hear if there's one book that you think people should consider. What is it? And then what else would you like to leave the audience with before we close?
I'm a big fan of The Introverted Leader by Jennifer Kahnweiler. She's someone who she's an extrovert, but she's someone who's studied introverts and has really helped drive conversation in this space. I think it's a area that's still not well understood, but certainly something that could be a differentiator as a leader if you really understand the differences between introverts and extroverts. So I'd highly encourage the audience, if you haven't heard of Jennifer Kahnweiler, she has a podcast. She has, similar to you, she has a lot of resource and has done a lot of really amazing things. And so I'd highly encourage the audience to look into Jennifer for sure.
Very cool. All right. Well, Jennifer, this was awesome. I really, really appreciate all your insight. This was fantastic. And to everybody listening, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you haven't already, subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.